There is a moment, somewhere between the last breath of sleep and the first full awareness of a new day, where the mind is completely unguarded. It has not yet remembered its worries. It has not yet recalled the argument from last Tuesday, or the bill that hasn't been paid, or the relationship that feels like it is held together by nothing more than habit and hope. For just a fraction of a second you are free. And then, without fail, the noise returns. The mental chatter floods back in. The fear reasserts itself. The grief, the uncertainty, the quiet dread of another day, all of it comes rushing back like a tide that has only retreated so it can strike harder. And most people, nearly all people, let it happen. They surrender the morning before they have even fully opened their eyes. They hand over the most powerful hour of the day to whatever chaos the mind decides to serve them. And then they wonder why nothing ever seems to change. But here is what the most disciplined minds in human history understood, minds that faced not just personal discomfort, but exile, slavery, war, the death of children, the collapse of empires. They understood that the morning is not something that happens to you. The morning is something you happen to. The way a day begins is not random. It is not determined by luck or circumstance, or whatever you happen to dream about the night before. It is determined by the first words you choose to send to your own mind. It is determined by the internal conversation that begins before you have spoken a single word out loud. And the men and women who mastered this practice did not do it with lengthy rituals or complicated systems. They did it with something far simpler, and far more powerful, than most people ever dare to try. They did it with words. Specific words. Chosen deliberately. Repeated until they became the automatic language of a disciplined soul. What you are about to hear in this video is not motivational rhetoric. This is not a collection of feel-good phrases that fade within 24 hours. This is not the kind of content that asks you to simply believe harder or want more passionately. What this is, and what you need to understand before we go any further, is a framework built entirely on Stoic philosophy, the same school of thought that carried Marcus Aurelius through the most turbulent years of Roman leadership, that gave Epictetus the capacity to endure slavery with a dignity that made his captors feel small, and that gave Seneca the ability to face death with a calm that confused everyone around him. These 5 words are extracted from their actual writings and teachings, stripped to their essence, and made practical for the reality of your daily life. And if you are someone who has been feeling stuck, not in a catastrophic way, but in that quiet, grinding, almost invisible way where the years start blurring together, then I need you to stay with me, because what comes next may genuinely alter the trajectory of your life. Before we begin, I want to ask you something. If this channel has given you value, if a video here has helped you think more clearly or feel less alone in what you are carrying, please subscribe right now. Hit that button. Because what we do here, the kind of deep, honest, philosophy-driven content that takes weeks to build and asks nothing of you but your attention, this work only continues when this community grows. Subscribe, and let's go. The foundation: why Stoicism and why now? You need to understand something about the world the Stoics lived in, because a common mistake people make when they encounter Stoic philosophy is they treat it like a beautiful but irrelevant artifact. They read a line from Marcus Aurelius and they think, yes, that is profound, and then they put it down and go back to their lives as though profound and applicable are two different things. They are not. The Stoics were not writing poetry. They were not composing inspirational content for future generations to screenshot and post. They were solving problems. Immediate, personal, excruciating problems. Marcus Aurelius was governing a Roman Empire under constant military attack from multiple fronts, while simultaneously watching a plague kill off a significant portion of his population. He wrote his famous Meditations not as a book to be published, but as a private journal, a series of notes to himself, written at night, in the dark, when the weight of power and loss could have crushed any other man. And every single entry begins with a reminder. A deliberate reorientation of the mind before the chaos of the next day could take hold. Epictetus lost his freedom as a child. He was born into slavery, a fact that would have, and did, destroy the mental and emotional lives of countless others. His owner, at one point, broke his leg deliberately, just to demonstrate control. And as the bone chapped and the pain was unbearable, the story goes that Epictetus said calmly that if you continue, you will break it. And when it broke, he said simply, "Did I not tell you that would happen?" There was no rage. There was no dissolution into despair. There was just a mind that had been so thoroughly trained to separate what it could control from what it could not, that even physical destruction could not touch the inner core. This was not some mystical gift he was born with. It was practice. Specific, deliberate, daily practice that began with the words he chose to think and speak when each day began. Seneca was one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in Rome, advisor to emperors, playwright, philosopher. He was also eventually ordered by Nero to take his own life on suspicion of conspiracy, a command he accepted with such measured composure that his death became one of the most documented examples of Stoic courage in history. He spent his final hours writing letters to friends, comforting those who wept around him, saying that what they mourned was only the body, and the body was never the thing worth protecting above all else. These three men, a general, a slave, and a senator, had nothing in common except this: they each began every day with a set of internal instructions that they gave to themselves before the world could give instructions to them. And the core of those instructions, the irreducible essence that survived centuries and still has the power to change the trajectory of a human life, can be distilled into 5 words. Just 5. Let us begin. Point 1: Enough. The first word is enough. And I want you to hold that word for a moment before we go further, because I suspect you have never genuinely heard it directed at yourself in the way it needs to be heard. Not enough in the sense of limitation. Not enough as in stop, you have gone too far. Enough in the profound and ancient sense that the Stoics used when they talked about autarkia, the Greek concept of self-sufficiency, of inner completeness that does not depend on external additions. The Stoics believed, with absolute conviction, that a human being contains within themselves everything they require to live a good life. Not a perfect life. Not a comfortable life. Not a life free of pain. But a good life, a life of genuine meaning, of principled action, of deep dignity. And the word enough, spoken to yourself each morning with full deliberate intention, is the act of claiming that truth before the world tries to talk you out of it. Here is why this matters with extraordinary urgency, especially for people who have lived long enough to feel the accumulated weight of what life takes from you. By the time most people reach the middle and later stages of their lives, they have spent decades in an almost continuous state of perceived insufficiency. There was never quite enough money, never quite enough time, never quite enough recognition from the people whose opinion they valued. They were never quite the parent they wanted to be, never quite the professional their younger self had imagined, never quite the version of themselves that lived, in theory, just around the corner, perpetually deferred to a future that kept moving forward every time they approached it. This is not weakness. This is not personal failure. This is what the modern world is specifically engineered to produce in you, because a person who feels sufficient has no need to buy the thing being sold, to seek the approval being withheld, to keep running on the wheel that someone else built and owns. The Stoics saw this mechanism operating in ancient Rome, just dressed in different clothing. The same patterns were there: the obsession with status, with the accumulation of things and titles and connections, the constant comparison of one life to another, the belief that something outside the self would eventually complete the self. And the Stoic response to all of it was not to deny that external things have value. They were very clear about this. A Stoic is not someone who refuses comfort, or pretends money is meaningless, or acts as though reputation is unimportant. A Stoic is someone who knows, who has trained themselves to know, at the deepest possible level, that none of those things are necessary for the quality of the inner life. That the inner life, in fact, is the only life that is truly yours. And the inner life is always enough. It is always complete. It has always been complete. The tragedy is that most people never pause long enough to recognize this. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations something that has sat with scholars for centuries. He wrote that a man's life is a mere moment, his existence a flux, his perception clouded, his body's composition corruptible. And then, in the same passage, he described the inner faculty, the rational mind, the capacity for virtue, the ability to choose, as if it were something almost sacred in its completeness. Not sacred as in fragile and protected, but sacred as in whole. As in needing nothing added. This was not the writing of a privileged man who never suffered. Marcus Aurelius buried several of his children. He watched his best general, Avidius Cassius, betray him and attempt to seize power. He endured years of disease sweeping through his legions, killing men he had personally commanded and in many cases personally cared for. And through all of it, he kept returning, in his private writing, to this one essential claim: what I am, at the core, is enough. What I have access to within myself, the capacity for reason, for virtue, for measured response, is sufficient for anything the world decides to put in front of me. Now here is the practical application of this word, because philosophy without application is just decoration. When you say enough to yourself every morning, you are not saying that you will not work to improve your circumstances. You are not declaring a surrender to stagnation. You are doing something far more precise. You are separating your fundamental worth as a human being from your current outcomes. You are insisting, before the day begins, that your value is not determined by what you achieve today, or what you have accumulated to this point, or what other people think about the life you have built. You are establishing, in the most internal and personal space there is, that you come to this day from a position of sufficiency rather than a position of desperate lack. And this distinction, sufficiency versus desperate lack, changes everything about how you engage with the challenges that will inevitably meet you before the day is over. Think about the quality of decisions made from a place of desperation versus the quality of decisions made from a place of measured confidence. Think about the conversations you have when you are scrambling for validation versus the conversations you have when you are secure enough in your own sense of self that you can afford to be genuinely curious about the other person rather than constantly assessing whether they approve of you. Think about the work you produce when you are panicked about being good enough versus the work you produce when you trust, not naively but genuinely, that you have the internal resources to meet the task. The Stoics were not arguing for complacency. They were arguing for a stable foundation. A foundation solid enough that you can take enormous risks, face enormous setbacks, and still maintain the kind of internal coherence that allows you to act with integrity rather than panic. Epictetus, who had every reason to feel insufficient, a man who owned literally nothing, who had been the legal property of another human being, spoke about this concept of inner completeness with a ferocity that his students reported was almost overwhelming. He would ask them, directly, what it is that you lack. And when they would begin to list the external things, money, status, freedom, comfort, he would stop them. Not because those things don't have practical value in navigating the world, but because listing them as the source of insufficiency was a fundamental category error. It was, he said, like a man who is grieving because he cannot fly like a bird. The limitation is real. The grief is unnecessary. What you are, Epictetus insisted, is a rational being with the faculty of will, the capacity to choose your relationship to every single thing that happens to you. That faculty is not partial. It is not almost complete. It is not improved by wealth or status or freedom in the external sense. It is, as it stands right now, this morning, in whatever circumstances you wake to, enough. There is a particular kind of suffering that belongs to the second half of life in a way it does not belong to youth. When you are young, insufficiency has a temporal quality. You are not enough yet, but the assumption is that yet will become now eventually. The youth assumes that accumulation and achievement will eventually produce the feeling of completion. And so the young person runs, and works, and strives, and waits for the arrival of the feeling. And for many people, the first devastating moment of genuine Stoic education comes when they realize, often somewhere in their 40s or 50s, that the feeling has not arrived. That they have built a great deal and still go to sleep with the gnawing sense that something essential is missing. This is not a failure of achievement. This is a failure of category. The thing they were waiting for cannot be found outside. It was never stored outside. It has always been inside, and the act of looking outward for it was always guaranteed to produce exactly the confusion and emptiness they feel. This is the Stoic truth that enough restores you to every morning. It is not a consolation. It is not a coping mechanism for people who have given up on getting more. It is an accurate statement about the architecture of human value. You are enough, right now, to face this day with dignity. You are enough, right now, to make choices that matter. You are enough, right now, to be of genuine service to the people around you. You are enough, right now, to meet grief without being destroyed by it, to meet success without being corrupted by it, to meet the ordinary, unremarkable middle of a Tuesday afternoon with something that feels, quietly and unspectacularly, like peace. That is what the Stoics were after. Not dramatic enlightenment. Not transcendence. Just peace. Just the sustainable, daily, ground-level peace of a person who knows, at the cellular level, that they are enough. The morning practice here is simple and it is non-negotiable. Before you check your phone. Before you think about what the day will require. Before you inventory your worries or your ambitions or your resentments, you say this word. You say it to yourself as though you mean it. And on the days when you do not feel like you mean it, you say it anyway. Because the Stoics understood something about the relationship between action and belief that most modern thinking gets completely backwards. Modern thinking says first feel it, then do it. First believe you are enough, then speak it as though you believe it. The Stoics reversed this entirely. They said, the speaking and the acting come first. The feeling follows. Not immediately. Not always dramatically. But it follows. Because the mind is not a passive receiver of truth. It is an active shaper of reality. And the words you give it, consistently, before the world has had its say, become the lens through which everything else is interpreted. Enough is not a destination. It is a daily practice. And it begins this morning. If you are finding value in this so far, take 10 seconds right now and subscribe to this channel. Because we are only just getting started, and what comes next is where this gets even more extraordinary. Point 2, forward. The second word is forward. And I want to be precise about why this particular word carries such enormous weight in Stoic practice. Because the word is not as simple as it appears. It is not just a directional instruction. It is not just a cheerful command to keep going when things are difficult. In the Stoic tradition, forward is a philosophical stance with deep roots in what the ancient thinkers called the discipline of action, the practice of continuing to act, to engage, to contribute, regardless of the outcome that action may or may not produce. The Stoics made a distinction that almost nobody in the modern world makes, the distinction between the action and the result. They argued, with careful and well-constructed logic, that the action is yours. The result is not. And a person who has truly understood this, truly built it into the architecture of how they begin their days, is a person who is liberated from one of the most paralyzing forces in human psychology, the fear of wasted effort. Let me tell you about one of the most important passages in all of Stoic literature, because it speaks directly to the word forward in a way that few things do. Marcus Aurelius, writing during his military campaigns that were going badly, that were consuming years of his life, that were extracting enormous costs in blood and resources without producing the quick, decisive victories his predecessors had managed, wrote this: "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He did not write this in a moment of triumph. He did not write it after a successful campaign, warm and well-fed and secure. He wrote it in the middle of the struggle, as a reminder he had to give himself repeatedly, because the nature of human psychology is such that the lessons we know intellectually are constantly being eroded by the noise of living. Forward, as a morning word, is the act of renewing that commitment every single day. It is the act of saying, I will continue to move in the direction of what I value, not because I am certain the outcome will vindicate the effort, but because the effort itself is the expression of who I am. There is a particular kind of paralysis that develops in people who have experienced significant setbacks. And by significant I do not mean minor inconveniences. I mean the kind of losses that reorganize a person's understanding of themselves and the world. The loss of a marriage. The failure of a business built over decades. The erosion of a friendship that was once the most stable thing in a person's life. The slow recognition that a career path they gave themselves to completely does not feel meaningful anymore. These are not small things. These are the kinds of blows that make the idea of moving forward feel not just difficult but potentially foolish. Because moving forward requires, to some degree, caring about the future. And one of the most reliable effects of deep loss is the suspension of the willingness to care. If caring led here, the heart reasons, then perhaps not caring is the safer strategy. The Stoics understood this response completely. They did not dismiss it as weakness. Epictetus, in particular, was very specific that the experience of grief and loss is not something to be suppressed or denied. A Stoic is not a person without feeling. A Stoic is a person who refuses to let feeling become the final word on what action is possible. He drew a distinction between the immediate natural response to loss, which is real and valid and deserving of acknowledgement, and the decision about what that response means for the next day, and the day after that. The grief is yours. It is real. The paralysis that follows grief is a choice. And it is a choice that compounds over time, each day of standing still making the next day of movement feel more impossible, until what was initially a reasonable pause becomes the permanent posture of a life. Forward does not mean pretending the grief is not there. Forward does not mean rushing past pain in a way that only delays and amplifies it. Forward means, very specifically, that every morning you renew your commitment to continue acting in alignment with what you value, even while the pain is present. Even while the uncertainty is present. Even while the voice that says it might all be pointless is present. The Stoic does not silence that voice. The Stoic hears it, notes it, and then acts anyway. Because the Stoics understood something about momentum that modern psychology has spent decades trying to articulate in clinical language. Movement generates the conditions for recovery in a way that stillness cannot. Not because activity is a cure for suffering, it is not, but because the act of engaging with the world, of continuing to show up for the things and people that matter, is the mechanism through which a human being reconstructs meaning after it has been shattered. Consider the specific Stoic practice known as premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. This was a daily exercise in which the Stoic would deliberately imagine the worst possible outcomes of the things they valued, not to generate despair, but to immunize against it. To rehearse, in the morning, the possibility that the project would fail, the relationship would end, the health would decline, the recognition would not come, so that when the day actually brought difficulty, the mind was not ambushed by it. It had already been there, in the imagination, and it had survived. This practice is deeply and directly connected to forward, because what it produces is a kind of fearlessness that is not based on the naive belief that bad things won't happen, but on the tested confidence that bad things have already happened, in the mind's rehearsal, and the self survived them. And a self that has survived the imagined worst is a self that can keep moving through the actual difficult. There is something that happens to people, over decades of life, that I want to name directly because it is one of the most common and least discussed forms of psychological suffering that exists: the gradual narrowing of the range of things a person is willing to attempt. In youth, the range is wide. The young person tries things they will fail at because they have not yet accumulated enough evidence of failure to make the risk feel catastrophic. But with each significant failure, each painful overreach, each investment of the self that did not return what was given, the range narrows. By middle age and beyond, many people are operating in a space so constrained by the accumulated memory of past risks gone wrong that the idea of genuine new beginning, of truly moving forward into something unfamiliar and demanding, feels not just frightening but almost physically impossible. And this narrowing, this shrinkage of the self-sense of what is possible, is not caused by age. It is not caused by declining capacity. It is caused by the slow daily repetition of a single implicit message that the mind sends to itself: not again. Forward is the direct counter to not again. It does not deny the history. It does not pretend the past failures didn't cost what they cost. It says, with full awareness of what the past contained, that the present moment is not the past. That the self who moves today is not the same self who was hurt in that previous attempt. That the accumulated experience, even the painful parts, especially the painful parts, has produced a depth and a resilience that the younger, unscathed self did not possess. And that this depth, This hard-won capacity to endure is not evidence that one should stop. It is evidence that one can go further than ever before, precisely because one now knows how to carry weight. Seneca wrote about time with an urgency that can feel almost alarming when you read it carefully. He argued that the greatest loss a human being experiences is not the loss of years but the loss of the living that happens within those years when they are surrendered to inaction, to procrastination, to the endless deferral of the life that is actually possible in favor of the comfortable paralysis of waiting for conditions to improve. He wrote that we must seize the day, but what he meant was more specific than that phrase has become. He meant that the decision to move forward, into difficulty, into uncertainty, into the demanding work of a life lived on purpose, must be made daily, and it must be made before the 100 small voices of caution and comfort and legitimate tiredness have their say. Forward, spoken first, spoken with intention before the day's noise begins, is the act of seizing the day in exactly the way Seneca meant. Now, forward as a daily word also has extraordinary implications for the relationships in your life, and I want to explore this because it is perhaps the least discussed application of this Stoic principle. The most damaging state in any relationship, whether it is a marriage, a friendship, a relationship between a parent and adult child, is not conflict. Conflict at least requires engagement. The most damaging state is the one where both parties have stopped moving, where an old resentment, or a significant hurt, or just the accumulated indifference of too many years of small neglects has created a kind of frozen quality to the connection. When nothing new is being risked, no genuine vulnerability is being offered, and both people are interacting not with who the other person is now but with the story they have built about who that person has proven themselves to be. This freezing is one of the great tragedies of long-term human connection. And it is not inevitable. But it requires, from at least one person in the dynamic, the daily choice to move forward rather than to remain lodged in what has already happened. The Stoic insight here is that moving forward in a relationship is not the same as pretending the past didn't happen. It is not forgiveness performed for show, or the suppression of legitimate grievance. It is the act of deciding, with full awareness of the cost, that the present moment offers more than the past can contain. That the person in front of you is more than the sum of their worst moments. That you are more than the sum of yours. And that choosing, each morning, to take one step toward genuine engagement rather than protective withdrawal is the most stoic, most courageous, most humane thing you can do with the time you have been given. Forward. Say it tomorrow morning. Say it before the coffee, before the phone, before the plan for the day has assembled itself in your mind. Say it as an act of will, directed not at some distant destination but at the very next moment. Not forward to the life you eventually want to have. Forward into the next hour. Forward into the next conversation. Forward into the next opportunity to act with integrity rather than fear. That is the Stoic meaning. That is the full weight and the full liberation of this word. One step. This day. Forward. Point 3. Strong. The third word is strong. And before you dismiss this as a simple piece of motivational instruction, before the part of you that has been told to be strong so many times that the phrase has lost its meaning reaches for the remote control, I need you to understand that the Stoic conception of strength is so different from the cultural version of strength that they are almost opposites. The cultural version of strength says, do not show weakness. Do not feel the difficult things. Do not let anyone see that you are struggling. Absorb everything without flinching and perform effortless competence at all times. This is not Stoic strength. This is Stoic strength's direct enemy. Because this cultural version of strength is, in fact, a form of elaborate performance, a constantly maintained facade that costs an enormous amount of energy and produces, over time, the very brittleness and fragility it was designed to prevent. It is armor that, worn too long, fuses to the skin. And a person fused to their armor is not strong. They are trapped. Stoic strength is something entirely different. It is rooted in what the Stoics called virtus, Latin for virtue, but with a meaning closer to excellence of character than modern usage suggests. Virtue, for the Stoics, was not a moral performance. It was not doing the right thing while people were watching, or maintaining a respectable public image. It was the internal quality of a person who has developed such a thorough relationship with their own character, who has examined themselves so honestly and consistently, that they know with precision what they are capable of and what they are not, what they will yield to and what they will hold against any pressure. This is strength in the Stoic sense. Not the absence of vulnerability. The exact, precise, unflinching knowledge of it. Marcus Aurelius was physically unwell for much of his reign. The historical record suggests he dealt with chronic pain, persistent illness, and a constitution that was simply not suited to the militarized life of a Roman emperor. And yet the Meditations reveal a man who, night after night, private and alone, wrestled with his own limitations with a directness that modern readers sometimes find startling. He wrote about his failures. He wrote about the gap between who he intended to be and who he had actually been that day. He wrote about his anger, his impatience, his exhaustion. Not to wallow, there is nothing of self-pity in his writing, but to know. Because a person who knows their weakness has something infinitely more powerful than a person who denies it. They have information. And with information, they can make choices. They can compensate. They can ask for help in precisely the places where help is needed. They can stop spending energy on the performance of strength and redirect that energy into the actual practice of it. Strong, said to yourself each morning, is not a declaration of invincibility. It is a declaration of sufficiency. It is saying, I have within me the qualities required to meet what this day contains. Not all possible days. Not every challenge that has ever existed. This day. With what I have, right now, I am strong enough for what is actually coming. This is a claim you can make with genuine confidence, because what you have, the accumulated experience, the tested resilience, the specific scar tissue of all the difficult things you have already survived, is not nothing. It is, in fact, considerable. Most people dramatically undervalue what their past survival has built in them, because they are focused on what it cost rather than what it created. Think about what it actually means to have lived through the things you have lived through. Think about the specific events, relationships, losses, reinventions that your life has contained by the point you are now at. If you are in your 40s, 50s, or 60s, the list of things you have survived is, if you examine it honestly, genuinely remarkable. Not because your life has been more difficult than others, perhaps it has not, that is not the point, but because you are still here. Still operating. Still capable of growth, of connection, of care. Every difficult thing you survived was teaching you something about your own capacity that could only be learned by going through it, not around it. Every grief that threatened to unravel you and did not unravel you was evidence, written in real experience, that you are stronger than you believe in the ordinary quiet of a Tuesday morning before anyone has asked anything of you. Epictetus, again, provides perhaps the most direct and least gentle version of this truth. He told his students that the difficulties they faced were not punishments. They were not random misfortunes distributed by a universe indifferent to justice. They were, in the framing he kept returning to, the training material. He used the image of a wrestler who asks for an easy opponent. Epictetus had no patience for this. He said that a wrestler who wants only easy opponents will never discover their actual strength. They will develop a flattering but false idea of their own capacity that will be immediately and humiliatingly destroyed the moment they encounter a real challenge. The purpose of the hard opponent, the difficult circumstance, the loss that refuses to resolve cleanly, is to reveal what is actually there. And what is revealed is always more than the person expected. This is why the morning recitation of Strong is not a form of wishful thinking. It is not asking you to believe something you do not have evidence for. It is asking you to draw the correct conclusion from the evidence you already possess. Because every morning you wake up having survived another round of whatever life has put in front of you is morning in which the correct reading of your own history is, I am strong enough for this. Not invincible. Not free of wounds. Not above the need for rest, for support, for the occasional complete collapse into the honest admission that today is difficult. But strong enough. There is an enormous distance between those two positions, invincible and strong enough, and the Stoics lived in that gap with extraordinary grace. There is also a specific form of strength that the Stoics addressed with particular depth, and I want to spend time on it because it is perhaps the form most needed by the generation of people watching this. It is the strength to remain yourself when the world is actively trying to shape you into something else. The Stoics called this the integrity of the self, the maintenance of what Marcus Aurelius described as your inner citadel. The idea is this: you have an inner core that is genuinely yours. Your values, your capacity for reason, your fundamental character as it exists when no performance is required and no audience is present. This inner core is, in the Stoic view, the only thing that is permanently and unconditionally yours. External things, reputation, health, relationships, money, physical comfort, can be taken. They have been taken, from every single person who has ever lived, in some form or another. But the inner citadel, the core of who you choose to be, is only ever surrendered. It is never taken. And the surrender is always a choice. The strength required to maintain this inner citadel is not dramatic. It does not usually require grand gestures or heroic stands. It requires something smaller and more relentless: the daily practice of checking in with your own values before external pressure has fully settled into your day, and making the quiet, consistent decision to remain aligned with what you actually believe rather than what the people and systems around you are rewarding. In the context of aging, and I want to speak to this directly because it is relevant for many people watching, there is a particular vulnerability that develops as a person moves through the second half of life, a vulnerability to the subtle pressure to become smaller, to take up less space, to have fewer opinions, fewer ambitions, fewer needs. The world does not always honor the full expressive humanity of older people, and the slow erosion of social visibility can, over time, produce a kind of internal erosion as well. A person who started to believe that smaller was appropriate, that quieter was appropriate, that the diminishment was deserved rather than imposed. Strong said every morning, is the refusal of that diminishment. It is the inner citadel being actively maintained rather than passively allowed to erode. It is the deliberate reclaiming, before the day's invisible pressures have begun, of the full size and weight and dignity of who you are. Not who you were at 25, because that person is gone and not the point. Who you are now, with everything you have survived and learned and lost and rebuilt, is the fullest expression of a human being that has ever existed in the history of the world. Because no one who has ever lived has had exactly this combination of experience and capacity and perspective. The strength you have right now, at this exact age and stage, is not a diminished version of some past strength. It is the most refined, the most tested, the most genuinely capable strength you have ever had. Say strong like you know that. Because it is true. Let me also address what happens physiologically and psychologically when you speak words of genuine affirmation to yourself in the morning, because this is not merely metaphorical. The research on the relationship between self-talk and the nervous system is increasingly clear. The way you speak to yourself, particularly in the early hours of the day when the mind is most receptive to the framing it will carry forward, has measurable effects on cortisol levels, on the neurological pathways that are activated as you move through your day, and on the quality of decisions you make under pressure. A person who begins the day with an internal narrative of inadequacy, of barely managing, of fighting against a fundamental sense of being outmatched by their own life, that person's nervous system is operating in a mild but persistent state of threat response all day long. And the decisions made from a nervous system in threat response are reliably, predictably worse than the decisions made from a nervous system that has been told, first thing in the morning, I am strong enough for this. This is not self-deception. This is what the Stoics would call philosophy in practice. They were not interested in abstract systems of thought that had no application to the lived experience of a human body moving through a demanding world. Every principle they articulated was intended to be embodied, to be felt as much as understood. Strong is a word that, repeated consistently, becomes something more than a word. It becomes a posture, a default orientation toward the challenges of the day, a baseline from which difficulty is engaged rather than avoided. And it builds. Each morning that you say it, you add one more layer to the foundation. Each day that you act from that word, not perfectly, not without stumbling, but with the general direction of a person who believes they have the capacity to engage, you produce evidence that confirms and deepens the claim. Until one day, and this day comes earlier than most people expect, the word strong is not something you have to consciously choose. It is simply who you are. Point 4. Choose. The fourth word is choose. And this one, I want to be very clear, is the most radical and the most consequential of all 5. Because choose does not mean what it sounds like it means on the surface. It is not an instruction to make better decisions, though better decisions will follow from it. It is not a reminder to think before you act, though thinking before acting is part of it. Choose, in the deepest Stoic sense, is a claim about the fundamental nature of human freedom. It is the assertion, philosophically precise, practically revolutionary, and deeply counterintuitive to every instinct that suffering produces, that no matter what circumstances you find yourself in, you retain the power to choose your relationship to those circumstances. Not to choose the circumstances themselves, because that is not how reality works. But to choose what those circumstances mean. To choose what they require of you. To choose who you will be in the face of them. This is the most compressed and most powerful idea in all of Stoic philosophy. Epictetus expressed it most directly. It is not the things that happen to us that disturb us, he said, but the opinions we form about them. Now, before you push back against this, because the immediate response of any thinking person who has actually suffered is to say that this sounds like a way of dismissing real pain, let me be precise about what he meant. He was not saying that the things that happen to us are neutral and only perception makes them bad. He was not denying that loss is loss, that injustice is injustice, that grief is grief. He was making a more careful and more powerful point, that the interpretation of events, the meaning assigned to them, the story told about what they mean for one's life going forward, is where human agency actually lives. And that this agency, this capacity to choose the meaning, is not destroyed by any external event. It is only ever surrendered. And surrendering it is always, in every case, a choice. Think about 2 people who experience the same significant setback. A job lost after 30 years. A marriage that ends after decades. A health diagnosis that requires a fundamental restructuring of how life is lived. These are real and devastating events. They are not small. And yet the observable reality is that different people respond to the same categories of event with wildly different trajectories. Some people, in the face of the very same objective circumstances, discover depths of themselves they did not know existed, redirect the energy of their lives into something that turns out to be richer than what they had before, and look back on the devastating event not with gratitude exactly. Gratitude is too neat and clean a word, but with a kind of hard-won recognition that the shattering was also, ultimately, a clearing. Others, in the face of the same circumstances, enter a declining spiral from which they never fully recover. And the determining factor, the Stoics argued, was not the nature of the event. It was the choice about what the event meant and what response it required. This is not a comfortable message. I want to acknowledge that directly, because the Stoic insistence on personal agency can be misread, and is sometimes misused, as a way of blaming people for their own suffering. That is not what this is. The Stoic idea of choice does not minimize what happened to you. It does not say you should have responded differently to the trauma, the grief, the betrayal. It says that starting right now, not yesterday, not in some idealized past, but in the present morning where you are sitting with this, you have the ability to choose your next movement. Not the whole journey. Just the next movement. And the next one after that. And the cumulative effect of consistently exercising that choice, of consistently refusing to surrender your agency to the interpretation that the events of your life have fully determined your future, that cumulative effect is what the Stoics call the good life. Marcus Aurelius wrote about choice in a way that is worth spending time with. He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This is, in 4 compressed sentences, the entire Stoic philosophy of choice. The obstacle is not the end of the road. The obstacle is a redirection. The obstacle contains, if you are willing to look at it with a certain kind of deliberate Stoic attention, Information about a route you would not have taken if the original path had remained open. The history of human accomplishment is almost entirely a history of people who chose to treat the obstacle as the way, who made the decision, consciously, repeatedly, often against enormous emotional resistance, to remain agents of their own lives rather than victims of their own circumstances. Now I want to apply this specifically to the kinds of choices that arise in later life, because they are different from the choices of youth in ways that are important. The choices of youth are primarily choices of direction, which career, which partner, which city, which identity to try on. These are expansive choices made against a backdrop of relative openness and a sense that any particular choice can be unmade if it proves wrong. The choices of later life tend to be different in character. They are less often choices of direction and more often choices of response. How to respond to the physical changes that are beginning to limit what was once effortless. How to respond to the loss of people, parents, friends, sometimes partners, who were essential to the landscape of a life. How to respond to the recognition that certain dreams will not be realized in the time remaining, not because the person failed but simply because time and circumstance ran a different course than ambition anticipated. These response choices are, in the Stoic view, where the deepest and most important expression of human character happens. The expansive choices of youth are exciting, but they are made when the self is still largely untested, when the full weight of what life can take is not yet known. The response choices of a seasoned life are made with full knowledge of what loss means, full knowledge of what failure costs, full knowledge of how finite time actually is. And a person who, armed with all of that knowledge, still chooses to engage rather than withdraw, still chooses to act with integrity rather than bitterness, still chooses to offer genuine care to the people in their life rather than the protective self-sufficiency of a heart that has decided it has been hurt enough, that person is, in the most complete and specific Stoic sense, a person who has mastered the discipline of choice. Choose, spoken every morning, is the act of reclaiming this agency before the day has had a chance to present its inevitable challenges. It is saying, whatever comes today, I will not lose myself to it. I will feel what I feel, fully and honestly, and I will still choose. I will be tired, and I will choose. I will be uncertain, and I will choose. I will be grieving, and I will choose. I will be angry, and I will choose. Not in spite of those things, not by suppressing them, not by performing a calm I do not feel, but through them, with them, inside of them, maintaining always the core Stoic conviction that who I am is defined not by what happens to me but by what I choose to do with what has happened to me. There is a specific application of this word that I want to address because it comes up in the lives of virtually everyone who has reached a certain point in their journey, and it is rarely discussed with the clarity it deserves. It is the choice about how to hold the people who have hurt you. Not the minor hurts, the careless words, the small disappointments, the ordinary frictions of sharing a world with other imperfect people. The serious ones. The betrayals that reorganized your sense of safety. The people who chose their own interests over yours in a moment when the stakes were real and the cost was yours. The people who, perhaps, were supposed to protect you and did not. What do you do with those people? Not legally, not socially, not in the public arena of how you present your grievances to the world. In the private arena of your own mind, your own narrative, your own morning self-talk, what do you choose to do with them? The Stoics were remarkably clear about this, and remarkably unsentimental. Marcus Aurelius wrote, repeatedly, about the people who had wronged him, political opponents, treacherous advisors, people who sought his downfall for reasons ranging from ambition to ideology to simple spite. And his response, worked out in the privacy of his journal, was always the same: they are acting according to their nature, as they understand it. They are doing what they believe is right or advantageous, with the knowledge and character they have. This is not his problem. His problem, his only problem, the only thing he is responsible for, is his own response. And his response, chosen deliberately every morning, was to continue acting with justice and reason toward everyone, including those who had acted unjustly toward him. Not because they deserved it. Because he did. This is choose at its fullest and most demanding expression. The choice to remain the person you want to be, regardless of how others have chosen to treat you. The choice to not let someone else's failure of character become the standard you hold yourself to. The choice to carry forward, into each new day, the full weight of your own values intact, not diminished by resentment, not distorted by the desire for revenge, not trapped in the amber of an old wound. This is genuinely hard. The Stoics did not pretend it was easy. But they insisted, with the full force of their philosophy and their lived example, that it was possible. And they insisted that the place where it becomes possible is the same place every morning, before the day begins, when you look at the word choose and decide, one more time, who you are going to be. Point 5. Rise. The fifth word is rise. And this word carries the full cumulative weight of the four that have come before it, because rise is not meaningful in isolation. Rise is what becomes possible when you have practiced enough, when you have committed to forward, when you have reclaimed strong, when you have exercised choose. Rise is the destination of those daily practices. Not a final destination, not the end of a journey that once reached, requires nothing further. But a daily destination. A morning destination. The state that each of those four preceding words is preparing you for. The state in which, fully equipped with the Stoic understanding of who you are and what you are capable of, you actually step into the day as something more than a survivor. You step into it as a person who is awake, deliberate, and fully alive to the possibilities that each new morning contains. The concept of rising in Stoic philosophy is connected to what Marcus Aurelius wrote about in what has become one of the most famous passages in all of his meditations. He wrote about the struggle of leaving the bed in the morning, the desire to remain in the warmth and the quiet, to delay the engagement with a demanding world, and he wrote about it as a philosophical challenge, not merely a physical one. He said that when you find yourself reluctant to rise, you must remember that you were made for something. Not in the grandiose sense of a cosmic assignment that you are uniquely positioned to fulfill, but in the practical sense that the nature of a human being, a rational, social, purposive creature, is oriented toward engagement, toward action, toward the contribution that only activity, not rest, can produce. And to deny that orientation, to choose, repeatedly and habitually, the warmth of avoidance over the challenge of engagement, is to act against your own nature. And acting against your own nature is, in the Stoic view, the most reliable route to the particular misery that comes from a life that feels small and unused. Rise is not about ambition in the conventional sense. It is not about chasing status, or achieving more, or proving something to someone who doubted you. It is about something both simpler and more demanding, the daily commitment to show up as the fullest version of yourself that the present moment makes possible. The Stoics were very careful to distinguish between the fullest version of yourself and the idealized version of yourself. The idealized version exists in the imagination and requires conditions that are rarely present. The fullest version exists in the actual circumstances of the actual day and requires only one thing: the willingness to rise. To bring everything you actually have, not everything you wish you had, not everything you used to have, not everything you might have if conditions were different, but everything you actually have, right now, to the specific challenges and opportunities that are waiting on the other side of the morning. Let me tell you about a particular form of rising that I think is the most important and the most neglected, because it runs directly contrary to one of the most persistent myths about later life. The myth says that rising, in the sense of genuine new beginning, genuine forward movement into unfamiliar territory, is something that belongs to the young. That a person who has reached a certain age has done their rising and now the appropriate posture is consolidation, maintenance, the dignified management of what has been built. This myth is not only false, it is actively harmful. Because the developmental psychology of human beings across the full span of life tells a different and more extraordinary story. It tells us that some of the most significant growth a person is capable of, not in physical strength, or even in formal cognitive speed, but in wisdom, in relational depth, in the capacity for nuanced judgment and genuine equanimity, happens not in youth but in the decades that the myth has labeled as beyond their peak. The Stoics knew this, because they were students of the whole human life, not just its early portion. Seneca wrote about the relationship between time and wisdom with a precision that remains remarkable. He argued that a long life, if lived with philosophical attention, is not just more of the same experience, it is a qualitatively different kind of experience. The person who has loved and lost and loved again understands love at a depth the young person who has only loved without losing cannot approach. The person who has built something and watched it fail and built again has a relationship to the meaning of work that is richer than anything the unbroken success can teach. The person who has faced mortality, in their own body, in the bodies of the people they love, and has continued to choose engagement over withdrawal has a relationship to the present moment that is, in a word, irreplaceable. Rise, for such a person, is not the straining effort of someone who has not yet arrived. It is the steady, unhurried, fully grounded movement of someone who knows exactly what they carry and exactly what it is worth. It is a rising that has nothing to prove and nowhere in particular to be that it isn't. It is the rising of the sun, which does not rise in a hurry and does not rise to impress anyone, but rises because that is its nature, and the world is better for it without the sun ever needing to know or be told. Now let me explore the specific Stoic practices that support the word rise, because it is important to understand that rise is not just a word, it is supported by a set of daily habits that the Stoics consider non-negotiable. The first of these is what they called the morning examination, the brief but focused review, before the day begins, of what the day will require and what the self is committed to. Not a detailed plan, not an elaborate scheduling exercise, but a moment of deliberate internal orientation. Marcus Aurelius practiced this every single morning, even at the height of military campaigns, even when his health was poor, even when the practical demands of ruling an empire left almost no margin for interior life. He gave himself a few minutes of directed reflection, and he moved into the day from that reflection rather than from the noise of immediate circumstance. The second supporting practice is what the Stoics called kathekon, the appropriate action. The idea that at every moment, there is an action available to you that is appropriate to your nature, your relationships, and your values. Not the perfect action, the Stoics were not perfectionists. But the appropriate one. The one that, if you asked yourself honestly what a person of good character would do in this specific moment with these specific resources, you would recognize as correct. Rise, in practical terms, means beginning each day with the commitment to perform the appropriate action, not the impressive one, not the safe one, but the appropriate one, in every situation that arises. This sounds simple. It is, in practice, one of the most demanding things a human being can commit to, because the appropriate action frequently requires things that are emotionally costly: honesty when silence would be easier, care when withdrawal would be safer, engagement when disengagement would be more comfortable. The third supporting practice is what I will call the evening accounting, the brief, honest review at the end of each day of whether you acted in alignment with your values. Not a session of self-punishment. Not an inventory of failures designed to generate shame. But a quiet, clear-eyed assessment of the distance between who you intended to be this morning and who you actually were today. Where the gap is large, you note it without drama and recommit to narrowing it tomorrow. Where the gap is small, where you actually rose today, actually showed up, actually made the choices that your best self would make, you acknowledge it with the same honesty. Because the Stoics understood that the skill of seeing yourself accurately, without the distortion of either excessive self-criticism or excessive self-congratulation, is itself a form of strength. And it is the foundation on which rise can be reliably built, day by day, morning by morning. I want to spend time now on what rise means in the context of the specific challenges that come with the arc of a life that has already accumulated significant experience. Because rise for a 25-year-old is one thing. Rise for a person who has already navigated decades of genuine complexity is something altogether different, and more nuanced, and I would argue, more interesting. The 25-year-old rises against a backdrop of relative openness, most possibilities still technically available, most of the major losses still in the future, the arc of the self still largely uncharted. The person in later life rises against a backdrop of known costs, known limits, known losses, known grief. And to choose to rise from that position, to bring the full weight of what has been survived to the project of continued engagement rather than allowing it to accumulate into a wall between the self and the world, is an act of courage of an entirely different order. Marcus Aurelius knew this intimately. By the time he was writing the most searching passages of his meditations, he had buried children. He had survived betrayal. He had watched the plague take people he personally valued. He was dealing with a body that was in decline and a military situation that had no good resolution in sight. And he kept rising. Not because rising was easy, his own writing makes clear that it wasn't, but because he understood, at the most practical and unromantic level, that the alternative was the slow surrender of everything that made a human life worth living. Rising was not optimism. It was not the performance of a positive attitude in the face of difficult facts. It was a daily decision, made in full possession of every difficult fact, to remain present and engaged and purposive in the face of a world that was not going to become easier simply because he needed it to. Rise says, I know what this life has cost me. I know what I have lost, and what I am losing, and what I will eventually lose entirely. I know that the morning I am rising into is not the morning of some idealized previous life but the actual morning of this actual life with all of its actual complications. And I choose, one more time, to rise into it. Not because I have resolved the complications. Not because the grief is gone or the uncertainty has been clarified or the fears have been quieted. But because I am here, and I am awake, and the day is genuinely possible in a way that no day will be once it has become yesterday. And possibility, the plain, unspectacular, daily possibility of a single morning, is worth rising for. There is a story connected to the Stoic tradition that has always moved me in a particular way, and I want to share it here because it captures, in a single image, what rise means at the deepest level. It is the story of the Stoic philosopher Cato the Younger, who in the final hours of his life, facing the conquest of Caesar and the collapse of the Republic he had spent his life defending, sat down and read Plato's Phaedo. Twice. He read it, considered it, put it aside, slept briefly, woke, and then made the final choice of his life with the deliberateness of a man who had spent every morning of his existence practicing exactly this, the choice to face whatever was in front of him with full presence, full awareness, and full character intact. His rising, on that last morning, was complete. Nothing had been surrendered. Nothing had been given away to fear or to despair or to the temptation to become less than himself in the face of an impossible situation. This is the ultimate expression of rise in the Stoic tradition. Not the dramatic, heroic rising of a single moment, but the cumulative effect of 10,000 ordinary mornings in which a person chose, quietly and without audience, to rise into the full expression of who they were. The 10,000 ordinary mornings that make the extraordinary morning possible. The 10,000 ordinary choices that, added together, constitute not just a response to a single crisis but a character, a self that has been so thoroughly built by daily practice that it does not dissolve under pressure because it is not primarily held together by favorable conditions. It is held together by the only adhesive that actually works, the consistent, daily, deliberate choice to be who you said you would be. Rise. Tomorrow morning, and the morning after that, and every morning you are given. Before the phone. Before the news. Before the day has had its way with your mood and your attention and your best intentions. Rise. Say the word. Mean it. And then let the word carry you. Bringing the 5 words together. Now I want to bring these 5 words together, because they are not 5 separate instructions. They are a single, integrated morning philosophy. A system. A sequence that, practiced in the right order with the right intention, creates something greater than the sum of its parts. Let me walk you through how this practice actually works in the real, practical, unglamorous world of an actual morning. You wake up. The first thought is whatever the first thought is. You do not fight it. You do not immediately try to replace it with something better, because fighting the mind's first movement is a battle you will lose every time. You simply note it, with the detached but not cold attention of the Stoic observer, and then you speak the first word. Enough. You say it before you move. You say it as the first deliberate act of the day. You are enough, As you are, in this moment, with this body, at this age, with everything you have accumulated and everything you have lost. You do not need to earn the right to this day. You do not need to justify your presence here. You are enough. Then, forward. You commit to movement. Not grand, sweeping, dramatic movement, the movement of the next hour. The movement of the specific actions this day requires. You commit to showing up. To engaging. To refusing the paralysis that fear and grief and accumulated history can produce, and moving, one step today, into the life that is actually available to you. Then, strong. You acknowledge what you carry. The full weight of your experience, your survival, your hard-won capacity to endure. You do not minimize it, and you do not perform it. You simply state the truth. You have what is required for this day. Not for every day. For this one. And this one is all that is actually asking anything of you. Then choose. You reclaim your agency. Before the day's circumstances have had the opportunity to assign you a role in a story you did not write, you establish the central fact of your freedom. You choose your response. Not your circumstances. Your response. And your response, chosen with intention rather than reaction, is the expression of who you actually are. Then rise. You get up. You enter the day. Not as someone who is managing their life from the outside, monitoring it for threats and managing it defensively. As someone who is living it, from the inside, with the full weight of everything you are brought deliberately and purposefully to bear on the possibilities that the morning contains. Enough. Forward. Strong. Choose. Rise. 5 words. Said in full awareness of what each one actually means. Said before the phone? Said before the news? Said before the first conversation of the day has had the chance to determine your emotional posture for the next several hours. Said as an act of will that is, in the Stoic sense, the truest expression of human freedom available to any person, regardless of their circumstances, the freedom to begin their own day. This practice does not require you to believe, immediately and completely, that these words describe you accurately. The Stoics were not sentimentalists. They did not require a feeling of conviction before the practice could begin. In fact, they explicitly argued against waiting for the feeling. The practice is the practice. The doing creates the being. You begin saying enough before you fully feel it, and the feeling follows. You begin saying forward before you have fully resolved the grief that makes movement feel costly, and the movement produces the conditions in which the grief can be carried rather than owned. You begin saying strong before you have fully catalogued all the evidence that confirms it, and the very act of reclaiming the word begins to reorganize the evidence your mind attends to. You begin saying choose before every external pressure has been removed from your life, and the claiming of agency in the face of those pressures is the exact practice that develops the strength to withstand them. You begin saying rise before you fully believe you have anything left to rise for, because the Stoics knew, and history confirms, in story after story of people who came back from the places where light seemed to have been extinguished entirely, that the rising itself, the simple daily act of getting up and showing up, generates the discovery of what there is to rise for. It is not found by sitting and waiting for it to reveal itself. It is found by moving toward it. It is found in the forward momentum of a life lived on purpose, beginning each morning with 5 words that are not, in the end, merely words. They are decisions. Made daily. Accumulated over weeks and months and years into something that no external circumstance can touch, a self. Fully realized, fully present, fully alive to the extraordinary ordinary miracle of a morning that has not yet been used. The Stoic legacy and why it belongs to you. I want to spend some time on something that is important, and that does not get discussed enough in popular conversations about Stoicism. There is a tendency, in the way Stoic philosophy gets presented in modern self-help culture, to make it feel like an elite discipline, something practiced by exceptional people in exceptional circumstances, inspirational and admirable from a distance but not quite applicable to the regular texture of an ordinary life. This is a fundamental misreading of what the Stoics were actually doing and who they actually were. Marcus Aurelius was, of course, an emperor. But his meditations were not the writings of a man performing philosophy from a position of comfortable elevation. They were the writings of a man in the middle of a mess, speaking to himself, not to posterity, not to future YouTube audiences, not to anyone except his own besieged and exhausted soul, about how to remain a decent human being when everything around him was conspiring to make decency feel pointless. The Emperor was writing the same things you need to hear, in the same darkness, for the same reasons. Not because he was unusual in his struggles, but because he was unusually honest about them. The meditations work because they are not the polished product of someone who had already figured it out. They are the raw, daily notes of someone in the process of figuring it out, just like you. Epictetus is even more important in this regard, because Epictetus had nothing. When we talk about a man who built a philosophy of inner freedom and daily practice from a position of absolute external constraint, we are not speaking metaphorically. He had no property, no legal rights, no autonomy in any external sense. His Stoicism was not a lifestyle practice. It was not a productivity system. It was a survival strategy, the only tool available to a mind that refused to allow its circumstances to determine its character. And the philosophy that emerged from that pressure, that extreme testing of what actually holds when everything external has been stripped away, is more applicable to a person living a regular American life in the middle of the 21st century than almost any other school of thought that exists. Because most of what troubles people, the anxiety, the sense of insufficiency, the feeling of being at the mercy of forces beyond their control, is not caused by the actual severity of their external circumstances. It is caused by the relationship they have with those circumstances. And that relationship is exactly what Stoicism addresses. Seneca had wealth, and lost it, and had it again, and was eventually ordered to give up his life. And through every variation of external fortune, his writing maintained the same central quality, an absolute refusal to let the quality of the inner life be determined by the quality of the outer one. This is not a message for exceptional people. This is a message for every person who has ever woken up on a difficult morning and wondered whether the tools they have are equal to the demands in front of them. The Stoics say yes. Always yes. Not easily yes. Not comfortably yes. But yes. The Stoic legacy belongs to you. It belongs to you specifically, because you are reading this in a moment of history that is, in its own specific ways, as demanding and as disorienting as any the Stoics navigated. The pace of change in the modern world, the fragmentation of shared meaning, the erosion of institutions that once provided structure and continuity, the overwhelming volume of information that makes it harder, not easier, to know what actually matters. All of this creates conditions in which the Stoic daily practices are not just valuable. They are, I would argue, close to essential. The capacity to remain anchored to your own values in a world that changes its values monthly. The capacity to distinguish between what is actually yours to control and what is not, in an age where everything from algorithms to news cycles to social media is designed to make you feel responsible for and threatened by things that are fundamentally outside your jurisdiction. The capacity to begin each day with a clear, internal statement of who you are before the day has had the chance to tell you, these are Stoic skills, and they are the skills most needed in the world right now. The 5 words are not a formula. They are not a shortcut. They are not the kind of thing that works if you say them once with curiosity, and then forget about them. They are a daily practice, and like all practices they require time and consistency before their effects become visible. A musician does not play a scale once and acquire the ability to perform. An athlete does not train for a single day and compete with the strength of someone who has prepared for months. The morning practice of these 5 words is the same kind of discipline, invisible in any single day, transformative across weeks and months of consistent application. It is the compound interest of the inner life. Small investments daily, that build something that no single large gesture could produce. Marcus Aurelius did not become the person reflected in his meditations overnight. He became that person across decades of daily practice, daily struggle, daily recommitment to the principles he held most dear. Epictetus did not develop his extraordinary equanimity in a single flash of insight. He built it through years of consistent attention to the only thing he could actually control, his own responses, his own thoughts, his own choices about what to give his energy and what to release. Seneca did not face his death with equanimity because he was inherently braver than other men. He faced it that way because he had been practicing for it, in the small deaths and small risings of every ordinary morning, for an entire lifetime. You have been practicing too. Perhaps not with this specific framework. Perhaps not with these exact words. But every morning you have gotten up in the face of difficulty, and there have been many such mornings, more than you usually remember to credit yourself for. You have been building the same capacity they built. Every time you have chosen honesty when deception would have been easier, care when withdrawal would have been more comfortable, movement when stillness would have been safer, you have been adding to the structure that these 5 words simply name and make visible. You are not beginning from nothing. You are beginning from everything you have already accumulated. And that, as the first word of your new morning practice insists, is enough. The science behind the Stoic morning. It is worth addressing, for those who want to understand the mechanism behind why morning words carry such disproportionate power over the quality of an entire day, the growing body of science that has, over the past several decades, been essentially rediscovering and confirming what the Stoics built by observation and practice 2,000 years ago. The convergence is remarkable, and it adds a layer of confidence to the practice that is, for many people, the difference between trying it once and making it a permanent part of how they begin their days. The human brain undergoes a distinctive transition in the first 30 to 60 minutes after waking. During this period, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain associated with rational thought, value alignment, and long-term decision-making, is gradually coming online after a night of rest. The limbic system, which handles emotional responses and threat detection, tends to be more immediately active in the first moments of waking, which is why the very first thoughts of the day often have an emotional, anxiety-colored quality. The worries, the unresolved problems, the fears, these are limbic activations occurring in a window when the more rational, values-oriented prefrontal activity is not yet fully engaged. What the Stoics understood, and what the practice of morning words implements, is the deliberate engagement of the prefrontal cortex before the limbic system's initial activation can establish the emotional tone of the day. By speaking specific, intentional, values-aligned words to yourself before the anxiety narrative can take hold, you are essentially choosing which part of the brain begins the day's conversation. You are giving the values-oriented, long-term thinking part of yourself first-mover advantage. And first-mover advantage in the brain is significant, because the mind tends to interpret subsequent information through the frame that has been established by its initial morning orientation. A person who begins the day from a frame of sufficiency enough will process the day's challenges differently than a person who begins from a frame of deficit. Not because the challenges are objectively different, but because the lens through which they are perceived has been fundamentally altered by the first internal conversation of the day. Research on what psychologists call self-affirmation, the practice of deliberate, values-based self-statements, has consistently shown that this practice reduces the physiological stress response in the face of challenging tasks, increases the quality of problem-solving under pressure, and improves interpersonal behavior in high-stakes situations. It does not eliminate stress. It changes the relationship to stress, which is, precisely, the Stoic formulation of what the morning practice is for. Not to make the day easier in its external demands. To make the self more capable of meeting those demands with full internal resources engaged. There is also a neurological dimension to the consistency element of this practice that is worth understanding. The brain operates on the principle of neural reinforcement. The patterns that are activated repeatedly become progressively easier to access, progressively more automatic, progressively more likely to be the default response in any given situation. When you practice the 5 words consistently over weeks and months, you are doing something specific and measurable in your neurology. You are building and strengthening the neural pathways associated with self-sufficiency, forward momentum, personal strength, agency, and daily renewal. You are making those pathways the path of least resistance. So that eventually, the default orientation of your mind in the face of difficulty is not the one that fear would produce, but the one that daily practice has installed. This is not metaphor. This is how brains actually change. And brains can change at every age. The notion that neurological plasticity is exclusively a property of youth has been thoroughly dismantled by contemporary neuroscience. The adult brain, including the aging brain, retains significant capacity for the kind of structural change that daily practice produces. The Stoics called this hexis, a kind of cultivated habit of soul that, once established, operates almost effortlessly because it has been made automatic by repetition. They distinguished it from momentary intention, which is the act of deciding to be a certain kind of person in a single moment. Momentary intention is exhausting because it has to be renewed from scratch every time the relevant situation arises. Hexis is what develops when you have renewed the intention so many times, in so many different contexts, that it no longer feels like an act of will. It feels like character. It is character. And it was built, one morning at a time, by the consistent, quiet, unglamorous practice of 5 words before the day began. For those who have given up on mornings, I want to speak directly to a particular group of people, because I know they are here. I know, because the comments on this channel and the letters that come in reflect a pattern that is consistent and heartbreaking in equal measure. The pattern of people who have, at some point in their lives, stopped believing that mornings hold any particular promise. Not because they are nihilistic in some dramatic philosophical sense, but because they have had enough mornings that began with hope and ended with disappointment that the act of beginning with hope has started to feel like a setup. The practice of rising with intention has started to feel like the first step in a cycle that always ends the same way. To those people, I want to say something that the Stoics would recognize immediately. What you have built, the protective caution, the guarded expectation, the armor against morning optimism, is not a character flaw. It is a reasonable adaptation to a pattern of experience. The mind is doing exactly what it was designed to do, learning from repetition, protecting you from the pain of repeated disappointment by reducing your exposure to the hope that precedes disappointment. This is the mind being intelligent. And the Stoics would say, good. You are using your rational faculty. Now use it more thoroughly. Because the conclusion the mind has drawn, that hope leads to disappointment, and therefore hope should be minimized, is not actually the lesson your experience contains. Your experience contains a different lesson, one that the Stoics would articulate like this: the external outcomes you were hoping for are not reliably under your control. That is the true lesson. And the correct adaptation is not to stop engaging with the morning. It is to change what you ask the morning for. The person who begins the day hoping for specific external outcomes, recognition from a particular person, a particular financial result, a particular resolution to a particular problem, is putting their morning in a very vulnerable position. They have made the success of the morning contingent on circumstances they cannot determine. And when those circumstances don't cooperate, which they frequently won't, not because the world is cruel but because most external outcomes depend on far more variables than any single person controls, the morning has failed. The Stoic practice is a different wager entirely. It does not ask for specific external outcomes. It asks for the quality of internal orientation from which any outcome can be met with dignity and intention. And that quality of orientation is completely within your control. It is the only thing that is completely within your control. Which means the morning, practiced in the Stoic way, cannot actually fail. Not because every day goes well. Because a well-practiced morning is not measured by how the day goes. It is measured by who you were as the day unfolded. And who you were, the integrity of your responses, the consistency of your values, the quality of your presence in the moments that were actually available to you, that is yours. Permanently. The day can take whatever it takes. It cannot take that. So to the person who has stopped trusting mornings, I am not asking you to trust them again in the way you trusted them before. I am asking you to trust something different. Not the outcomes that the morning might deliver. The self you can be in the morning. The internal orientation you can choose, independent of every external variable, before the day has had its way with you. Enough. Forward. Strong. Choose. Rise. These are not hopeful predictions about what the day will bring. They are accurate descriptions of what you are capable of. And that accuracy, grounded not in optimism but in the Stoic discipline of honest self-knowledge, is the foundation on which something genuinely new becomes possible. The long game, what Stoic mornings build over time. The most important thing to understand about this practice, and I want to leave you with this understanding because it is what determines whether the practice becomes genuinely life-changing or remains a pleasant idea that fades within a week, is the nature of what it builds over time. Not over days, not even over a single week. Over months and years of consistent application, what this morning practice builds is something the Stoics considered the most valuable thing a human being can possess, what they called eudaimonia. A word usually translated as happiness, but which means something far more specific and far more interesting than the modern usage of that word. Eudaimonia, in the Stoic understanding, is not a feeling. It is not the pleasant sensation of having your desires met, or the comfort of circumstances going well, or the warmth of being liked and appreciated by the people around you. All of those things are pleasant. The Stoics called them preferred indifference, and there is nothing wrong with enjoying them when they are present. But they are not eudaimonia, because they are not reliably producible by the individual and they are not reliably durable when produced. Eudaimonia is the state of a person who is living fully in alignment with their highest rational nature. A person who is doing what they were built to do, bringing reason, virtue, and genuine care to the full range of their human relationships and activities, and who knows, at some level that does not require external confirmation, that this is what they are doing. It is the deep, quiet, steady flourishing of a well-lived life. Not dramatic. Not showy. Often invisible from the outside, but felt on the inside as something that no change of fortune can fully reach. This is what the 5 morning words are building toward. Not in the explosive, immediate way that motivational content often promises. In the slow, reliable, cumulative way that genuine practice always produces. Each morning you say enough, you add one small brick to the foundation of a self that does not need external validation to feel complete. Each morning you say forward, you add one small brick to the structure of a self that meets difficulty with momentum rather than retreat. Each morning you say strong, you add one small brick to the building of a self whose self-knowledge includes its own resilience. Each morning you say choose, you add one small brick to the architecture of a self that experiences agency as its default condition rather than its exceptional one. Each morning you say rise, you add one small brick to the edifice of a self that enters each day as a deliberate participant in its own life rather than a passive recipient of whatever circumstances decide to deliver. In a month, the structure is beginning to take shape. In 3 months, it is recognizable. In a year, it is substantial. In a decade, it is the whole landscape of who you are. And who you are, the person you have built, one morning at a time, through the small daily practice of 5 words chosen with full Stoic intention, is the only genuine wealth a human being can accumulate. The only possession that cannot be taken. The only achievement that cannot be revoked by bad luck, or bad economics, or the inevitable encroachments of time. Your character. Your inner life. The quality of who you are when nothing external is supporting you and nothing external is watching. Marcus Aurelius built that character in some of the worst conditions imaginable for a human being in a position of responsibility. Epictetus built it in the worst conditions imaginable for a person without any power at all. Seneca built it in the strange, unstable, ultimately fatal conditions of proximity to imperial power. They had almost nothing in common except this: each of them, every single morning, had a practice that began with something they said to themselves before they allowed the world to say anything to them. Something that oriented them toward their own values, their own capacity, their own agency. Something that established, before the noise began, who they were. So that when the noise came, and the noise always came, they were already themselves. Already whole. Already enough. Be yourself before the noise. That is the Stoic morning in its entire essence. 5 words. Every morning. Your life, rebuilt from the inside out. Not instantly. Not easily. But genuinely, deeply, irreversibly. The daily ritual, making this practice permanent. Let me be practical about implementation, because the Stoics were nothing if not practical. They did not deal in beautiful principles that could not be lived. Every single thing they taught was designed to function in the actual world, with actual competing pressures and actual imperfect human beings trying to navigate them. So here is how you make this practice permanent rather than another good intention that dissolves in the friction of daily life. The first and most important thing, location. The Stoics placed enormous importance on the physical conditions that support inner practice. Marcus Aurelius wrote his meditations at night, often after the military camp had gone quiet, in the specific physical space of his personal tent. The location was not incidental. It was part of the practice. The mind associates specific physical locations with specific modes of being, and the consistent use of a specific place for a specific practice deepens the practice's effects over time. Find a place, a chair, a spot by a window, anywhere that is yours and that is quiet for even 5 minutes in the morning, and make it the place where the 5 words are spoken. The consistency of location compounds the practice. The second thing, voice. Say the words aloud when you can, or at minimum sub-vocalize them with deliberate intention rather than running them as a background thought. The Stoics were deeply interested in the power of the spoken word, not in any mystical sense, but in the very practical sense that speaking a thing requires a different quality of commitment than merely thinking it. When you say enough out loud, even quietly, even in the private space of an early morning, you are making a claim that has slightly more binding quality than an internal thought. You are, in a small but real way, holding yourself accountable to what you have said. The verbal commitment is part of the practice. The third thing, sequence. Always enough first, then forward, then strong, then choose, then rise. The sequence is not arbitrary. Enough establishes the foundation of sufficiency from which all the others build. Forward establishes the directional commitment. Strong gathers the resources. Choose asserts the agency. Rise initiates the action. Moving through them in order each morning creates a consistent internal narrative arc, from stability, through commitment, through resource gathering, through agency claiming, into action, that over time becomes the default architecture of how you approach difficulty. It is a script for the self, and like all scripts, it is most effective when practiced consistently and in full. The fourth thing, brevity. The practice should take no more than 5 minutes. It is not a meditation session. It is not a journaling exercise. It is not an elaborate morning ritual that requires perfect conditions to execute. It is 5 words, 5 minutes, every morning, regardless of what the morning brings. One of the most important Stoic principles about practice is that it must be robust enough to continue in imperfect conditions, because imperfect conditions are the norm, not the exception. If your morning practice can only happen when you slept well, when the house is quiet, when nothing urgent is competing for your attention, then your practice has been designed for conditions that rarely exist. Design it for the difficult mornings. The easy mornings take care of themselves. The fifth thing, accountability to your past self. Keep a simple record. Not an elaborate journal, just a mark, a note, a line in your phone that says you did the practice today. The Stoics called this the daily account, and Seneca specifically wrote about the practice of reviewing each day's conduct before sleep, not as a source of guilt but as a source of information. Over time, the record of your practice becomes one of the most powerful motivators available. You do not want to break the chain. The evidence of your consistency is itself a form of strength. Each mark in the record is a small, undeniable proof that you are a person who does this. And the self that is identified as a person who does this finds the practice progressively easier to maintain, because it has become part of the story of who you are. The sixth thing, patience with irregularity. There will be mornings, many of them, when you do not do this. When the alarm fails or life imposes itself before you have found your space. When grief or illness or just the flat exhaustion of a difficult week makes the very idea of intentional morning practice feel like one demand too many. This is not failure. This is the Stoics' reality, a practice embedded in the real, irregular, demanding texture of an actual life. When you miss a morning, you note it without drama and begin again. Not from scratch. The previous practices have already built something that a single missed morning does not dismantle, but from where you are. With whatever you have. Today. Enough. Forward. Strong. Choose. Rise. A word to the person who needed this today. I want to speak directly now to the person who found this video at a specific kind of moment. Not the average morning of average difficulty, but the kind of morning that comes after a genuinely hard period. After a diagnosis, or a loss, or the quiet collapse of something that was supposed to hold. After the kind of months that have a before and after built into them, where everything on the near side of the event looks fundamentally different from everything on the far side. If you are at that place right now, I want you to hear something clearly, directly, without the softening that sometimes well-meaning people apply to difficult truths. The Stoics were made for this. What you are carrying right now is exactly the weight these 5 words were designed for. Not the light days. Not the ordinary Tuesdays when everything is basically fine and the morning practice is a pleasant discipline that makes a decent day slightly better. The dark days. The days when the alarm sounds and the first thought is the unbearable one. The days when getting out of bed is not a small exercise in self-discipline, but a genuine act of courage. The days when enough feels like a claim so far from your actual experience of yourself that saying it seems almost cruel. Those are the days the Stoics were writing for. Those are the mornings Marcus Aurelius was addressing when he wrote to himself in the pre-dawn quiet after a day that had cost more than he had. Those are the mornings Epictetus was building his philosophy for, not the comfortable mornings of a comfortable life, but the mornings where the simple fact of continuing requires a deliberate and conscious choice. On those mornings, you do not say enough because you feel it. You say it because the Stoics discovered something that 2,000 years of evidence has not been able to refute, that the truth spoken in the dark finds its confirmation in the light. That the claim made before the day begins shapes the day in ways that the day would not shape itself without the claim. That you are, right now, in whatever state you are in, enough to take the next step. Just the next one. Not the whole journey. The next step. And then the next word. Forward. Because the Stoics were never asking you to run. They were asking you to move. At whatever pace your current state permits. In whatever direction your current values indicate. With whatever resources your current reality provides. Forward from here. Not from the person you used to be or wish you were. From here. Strong. Because you are. I know you may not feel it, and the Stoics would not ask you to perform a strength you do not currently have access to. But the fact that you are here, reading this, in the difficult morning, looking for something that might help, that is strength. That is the specific form of strength that the Stoics valued most, not the strength of the person who has never been broken, but the strength of the person who has been broken and is choosing, one more time, to put themselves back together enough to take the next step. Choose. Because the choice is still yours. The circumstances are not yours. The loss is not yours to have avoided or prevented. The difficulty of what you are carrying is not something you chose. But your response is yours. And in the choosing of your response, the choosing, again and again, of who you will be in the face of what has happened, you are exercising the only freedom that no circumstance can take. You are being, in the most complete sense, a human being. Rise. Please. Not because the day promises to be easy. Not because the grief will be gone by evening. Not because everything will be resolved in any timeline that feels adequate to the enormity of what you are carrying. Rise because the morning is here and it is actually offering something, and that offering is specific and real and irreplaceable. The chance to be yourself, deliberately and with intention, in one more day of this extraordinary, painful, bewildering, astonishing life. Closing, what Marcus Aurelius would say to you. I want to end with something that I think is perhaps the most important thing this video contains. I want to give you one final thought from Marcus Aurelius, the man who, more than anyone else in the Stoic tradition, combined the full weight of philosophical practice with the full weight of lived human experience, and did it without the protection of distance or privilege or the safety of an academic life lived far from consequence. He wrote, near the end of his meditations, something that is easy to read past but impossible to forget once it lands: loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight. He was not being glib. He was not minimizing. He was a man who had lost his children, lost his health, lost his best general to treachery, lost years of his reign to plague and war. He was writing from inside the loss. And what he was saying, to himself, privately, in the dark, was this: the thing you are grieving is not a violation of the natural order. It is the natural order. The movement of all things from what they are toward what they are becoming. The river does not grieve when it reaches the sea, even though the river as it was no longer exists. The tree does not resist the autumn. Not because the tree is indifferent to its own leaves, but because the tree knows, if we can speak of trees knowing anything, that the autumn is the condition of the spring. That the loss is the preparation for the new. You are in an autumn. Some of you are in a very deep and very cold one. And Marcus Aurelius, the man who had more power than almost any human being who has ever lived and used it to write private notes to himself about how to remain a decent person in impossible circumstances, that man would say to you what he said to himself on his own difficult mornings: this is nature. This is the turn of the great wheel. You have what is required to meet it. You have always had what is required to meet it. The 5 words are not magic. They are not a cure. They are the consistent, daily, non-negotiable act of returning to yourself. Of choosing yourself, one morning at a time, in the face of whatever nature has decided to deliver. You have been doing that for longer than you know. You have been doing it on the mornings you never thought to name as practice. Every morning you got up in a year that cost you something real. Every morning you moved toward the life available to you rather than collapsing into grief for the one that wasn't. Every morning you were, in the most essential and unspectacular way, enough. And forward. And strong. And choosing. And rising. You have been a Stoic, without the name, for the whole of your difficult and beautiful life. Now you have the name. And with the name comes the intention. And with the intention comes the practice. And with the practice comes the person, built one morning at a time, on the foundation of 5 words that are, in the end, not 5 words at all. They are one single truth, said 5 different ways. You are capable of the life that is actually available to you, beginning right now, in this morning, with everything you have and everything you are. Say the words. Every morning. Without exception. Build the life. Final call to subscribe. If you have made it this far, if these words have sat with you in a way that feels like they might actually mean something beyond this single viewing, then I want to ask you for something. Not much. 30 seconds and 1 click. Subscribe to this channel. Because this is the kind of content that takes everything I have to build: the research, the structure, the writing, the commitment to making every single video something you can sit with for an hour and walk away changed. And that work only continues, and only reaches the people who need it, when this community grows. So hit subscribe. Share this video with someone who needs it today. Leave a comment if something in here hit differently than you expected. Let me know which of the 5 words you needed most this morning. This channel exists because the Stoics believe something that I believe, that philosophy is not an ornament. It is a tool. It is the most practical tool human beings have ever developed for the problem of being alive and being human in a world that is beautiful and terrible in equal measure, and does not slow down to give you time to figure it out. Every video here is built on that belief. Every word is chosen for the person who is sitting where you are sitting, carrying what you are carrying, looking for something that is honest and demanding and genuinely useful. Not comfortable. Useful. Subscribe. Be here for the next one. Because what is coming next on this channel is going to be everything this one was, and then some. The Stoics have more to teach us. And we have more mornings in which to practice. Enough. Forward. Strong. Choose. Rise. Every morning. Starting tomorrow.